The cold wind moved through the wall like a whisper of old ghosts. Jon Snow stood on the icy battlements, his black cloak snapping behind him. Below him, the frozen forest stretched into darkness. Somewhere out there were wildlings, giants, and worse things people in the south did not even believe existed. But tonight, Jon's thoughts were not on the dead or the darkness beyond the wall. They were on a choice. Stannis Baratheon's words still echoed in his mind. Take the name Stark, become Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, marry the wildling Princess Val, unite the North and the free folk under my banner. It had sounded impossible the first time he heard it. A bastard becoming a Stark. The dream he had buried since childhood suddenly placed before him like a shining sword. Jon closed his eyes. He could almost see his father's face, Ned Stark, standing in the great hall of Winterfell. What would you do, father? Behind him, boots crunched on ice. You stare at the woods like they owe you money. Jon did not need to turn to know the voice, Tormund. The huge wildling leaned against the icy wall, red beard moving in the wind. You thinking about the Southern King again? Jon sighed. Stannis eyed him. Tormund studied Jon carefully, and the girl. Jon finally turned. Val. Even thinking her name made something strange move in his chest. She was not like the ladies of the South. No silks, no shy smiles. She moved like a wolf and looked at people like she could see straight through them. When she walked through Castle Black, even the Black brothers noticed. Stannis thinks marrying her would unite the wildlings, Jon said. Tormund laughed loudly. Wildlings don't unite because of weddings, Crow. Maybe not, Jon said, but they follow strength. Tormund scratched his beard. And they respect you. You saved thousands at Hardhome. You let our people through the wall when the rest of your crows wanted us dead. Jon looked back toward the forest. I'm Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Are you? Tormund said softly. Jon frowned. You think those Black brothers love you? Tormund continued. Half of them whisper when you pass. They think you've forgotten your vows already. Jon knew it was true. He had seen the looks, heard the quiet muttering. Wildling lover. Traitor. The wind grew stronger. If you stay, Tormund said, they'll never trust you. If you leave, the North might. Jon felt the weight of the decision pressing on him like the cold itself. A bastard his whole life. Always almost a Stark, but never truly one. Until now. Have you spoken to Val? Tormund asked. Jon hesitated. No. Tormund grinned. Then you should. The torchlight inside Castle Black flickered against the stone walls. Jon walked through the courtyard slowly. Men stopped talking when they saw him. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked away. The Night's Watch was changing, and not everyone liked it. Near the stables, he finally saw her. Val stood beside a white horse, brushing snow from its mane. The torchlight made her pale hair shine like silver. She looked up before Jon even spoke. You walk like a man carrying a mountain, she said calmly. Jon stopped a few feet away. You heard. I hear many things. Of course she did. The entire castle was gossiping about Stannis' offer. Jon folded his arms. The king wants me to marry you. Val tilted her head slightly. And what do you want? The question struck harder than he expected. What did he want? Winterfell. A true name. A chance to protect the North. But also freedom from the black cloak he had sworn never to remove. I don't know, Jon admitted. Val studied him for a long moment. There was no mockery in her eyes, only curiosity. You're an honest man, she said. That's rare. She stepped closer. If you marry me, the wildlings will listen. Many already follow you, but some will hate you for it. Jon almost laughed. I'm used to being hated. Val smiled slightly. But you must understand something, Crow. Jon raised an eyebrow. I will not be a southern lady, she said firmly. I won't sit quietly in a castle while men talk about war. If we marry, we rule together. Free folk do not kneel easily. Jon felt something surprising, not fear, but respect. That sounds fair. Val looked at him carefully. You're thinking about Winterfell. Jon nodded slowly. It was my father's home. And now it is filled with your enemies. The Boltons ruled there now. The thought made Jon's hands tighten. If you take Stannis' offer, Val said quietly, you will have to fight for it. I know. And many will die. Jon looked her straight in the eyes. They already are. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Only the cold wind moved through the yard. Finally, Val said something unexpected. If we do this, it will change everything for your people and mine. Jon took a slow breath. The wall behind him. Winterfell ahead. A crown he never asked for, but might have to take. He realized something in that moment. His life at the wall might already be ending. I think, Jon said quietly, I need to speak to King Stannis again. Val smiled slightly. Then the game has already begun. Far above them, the wall stood silent under the moon. And somewhere in the darkness beyond it, the real war was coming. The night after Jon spoke with Val, sleep never came easily. He lay awake in the Lord Commander's chambers, staring at the wooden ceiling above him while the wind screamed outside Castle Black. Every creak of the tower sounded louder than usual, like the wall itself was waiting for his answer. Jon had faced battles, wildlings, and even the strange dead things beyond the wall, but this choice felt heavier than any sword. If he accepted Stannis' offer, he would break his vows. The words of the Knight's watch oath echoed inside his mind. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children. He had spoken those words before the heart tree, before the old gods. Yet things were different now. The world was changing, the dead were rising. The Night's watch was weaker than it had been in hundreds of years. And Winterfell. That thought alone tightened his chest. Winterfell was not just a castle, it was his childhood, the place where he learned to ride, where Arya laughed while chasing cats through the halls, where Bran climbed the towers even when everyone told him not to. It was home. But the Boltons had turned it into something ugly. Jon sat up slowly and rubbed his face. There was only one man who could make this real. King Stannis. Morning came grey and bitterly cold. Castle Black moved with its usual rhythm, brothers training in the yard, stewards hauling supplies, ravens crying from the rookery. But the whispers had grown louder. Jon could feel eyes on him everywhere he walked. Some curious, some angry, some fearful. When he entered the king's tower, the guards stepped aside without speaking. Inside, the room was dim. A single fire burned weakly in the hearth. Stannis Baratheon stood beside a wooden table covered with maps. His sharp face looked even harder in the cold light. Davos Seaworth stood nearby, his quiet eyes watching Jon carefully. You took your time, Lord Commander, Stannis said without looking up. I needed to think. Stannis finally raised his eyes. Thinking too long is a luxury war rarely allows. Jon stepped forward. You offered to make me Jon Stark. I did. And you want me to marry Val? Yes. Jon looked directly at him. If I accept, what happens next? Stannis walked slowly around the table, placing one finger on the map of the north. First, you are legitimized as a Stark by royal decree. That gives you the right to claim Winterfell. His finger tapped the castle drawn on the map. Then we march south. Davos spoke quietly. The north remembers the Starks, lad, more than it remembers the Boltons. Jon knew that was true, but wars were not won by memories. The wildlings will follow if I marry Val, Jon said. Stannis nodded slightly. They will follow you, not me, which makes them useful. Jon did not like the way he said that. They are people, Jon said firmly. Stannis' expression did not change. People win wars. Silence filled the room for a moment. Then Stannis asked the question that mattered most. Well, Lord Commander, have you decided? Jon thought of the wall. He thought of his brothers. But he also thought of the coming winter and the dead that marched in the darkness. The North needed to be united. Slowly, Jon spoke. Yes. Davos leaned forward slightly. Stannis watched him carefully. I will accept your offer, Jon said. For the first time, a faint shadow of satisfaction appeared in Stannis' eyes. Good. Jon continued. But I have conditions. That surprised the king. You make demands of your king. I protect the North, Jon replied. That is all I have ever done. Stannis crossed his arms. Speak. The wildlings who came south of the wall are under my protection, Jon said. No burning them, no hunting them, no treating them like animals. Davos nodded approvingly. Stannis looked irritated but thoughtful. Very well. Jon continued. And Val will not be treated like a political prize. That almost made Davos smile. She is not your hostage, Jon said firmly. If we marry, it will be as equals. Stannis stared at him for several seconds. Then he gave a short nod. Agreed. The king walked back to the table and rolled up the map. Then it is settled. Jon Snow felt something strange in that moment. Like his entire life had shifted. You are no longer just Jon Snow, Stannis said. You are Jon Stark, rightful Lord of Winterfell. The name hit him harder than any sword. Jon Stark. For a moment, he could not even speak. But outside the tower, the storm had already begun. Later that evening, the courtyard of Castle Black was tense. Jon stood before a group of Black brothers. Bowen Marsh, Othel Yarwick, several other officers of the Watch. Their faces were grim. Bowen Marsh spoke first. We hear troubling rumors, Lord Commander. Jon kept his voice calm. Then you should hear the truth. The wind moved through the yard as Jon spoke the words. I have accepted King Stannis' offer. Murmurs erupted instantly. What? You can't. You swore. Jon raised his voice. I am leaving the Night's Watch. That made the yard explode with angry voices. You swore an oath. Traitor. Wildling lover. Bowen Marsh's face had gone pale with rage. You abandon your brothers for a crown. Jon felt anger rising but forced it down. I am trying to save the North. You swore to the Watch, Bowen shouted. Jon stepped closer. And what happens when the dead come, he demanded. Who will unite the North then? Who will fight them? But many men were no longer listening. The anger had already taken root. Jon saw hatred in their eyes. And in that moment, he realized something chilling. Some of these men might rather kill him than see him break his vows. Far across the yard, Val watched silently. Tormund stood beside her, gripping his axe. The storm was only beginning. The cold seemed sharper that night. After Jon's announcement, Castle Black felt different. The same walls stood, the same torches burned, but the air carried something darker. Suspicion, anger, fear. Jon could feel it everywhere he walked. Brothers who once greeted him now avoided his eyes. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Even the clang of the forge sounded harsher, like the castle itself was judging him. Inside the Lord Commander's chambers, Jon stood beside the small fire, staring at the flames. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. A quiet knock came at the door. "Enter," Jon said. The door opened slowly, and Samwell Tarly stepped inside, wrapped in his thick black cloak. His round face looked pale and worried. "Jon." Jon turned. "Sam." Sam shut the door behind him quickly, as if afraid someone might hear. "They're angry," Sam whispered. Jon sighed softly. "I noticed." Sam stepped closer. "It's worse than angry," he said. "They're meeting, Bowen Marsh, Yarwick and some others. They say you've broken your oath." Jon rubbed his temples. "They're not wrong. But they don't understand," Sam said quickly. "The wildlings, the dead, everything that's coming. They don't want to understand." Sam looked down at the floor. "They're calling you a traitor." Jon felt a familiar sting in his chest. He had heard that word before. Bastard, traitor, oathbreaker. Sometimes it felt like the world had decided what he was long before he ever had a choice. Sam spoke again, quieter this time. "They might try to stop you." Jon looked up. "How?" Sam hesitated. I don't know." But the fear in Sam's eyes said more than his words. Jon walked to the window and looked out across the courtyard. Snow had started falling again, covering the ground in white silence. He knew the truth. The Night's Watch had always been built on one thing: honor. And in their eyes, he had just shattered it. Across Castle Black, inside a dim storage hall, several men stood gathered around a table. Bowen Marsh was among them. His round face was red with anger. "He has betrayed us," Marsh said. A few brothers nodded grimly. "He means to abandon the watch," one man muttered. "And marry a wildling," another added with disgust. Othel Yarwick crossed his arms. "The men won't accept it." Marsh leaned forward. "The watch cannot survive if its Lord Commander breaks his oath." One of the younger brothers spoke nervously. "What do we do?" The room fell quiet. Finally, Marsh said the words no one else wanted to say. "The same thing men have always done with traitors." Silence spread across the room like ice. Some of the brothers looked uncomfortable, but others nodded slowly. "He has already chosen the wildlings over us," Marsh continued. "Soon he will take the north with their help." "And what happens to the Night's Watch then?" Yarwick asked. Marsh answered without hesitation. "It dies." A long pause followed. Then one man whispered the word they had all been thinking: assassination. The torches crackled in the silence. Finally, Marsh nodded. "For the watch." Later that night, Jon walked through the quiet courtyard. Snow drifted through the air, soft and endless. Most of the castle had gone to sleep, but Jon knew sleep would not come to him. Footsteps approached from behind. "You look like a man waiting for wolves." Jon turned. Val stood there, wrapped in a fur cloak. Snow rested lightly in her pale hair. "Maybe I am," Jon said. She studied his face. "Your brothers hate you now." Jon gave a small, tired smile. "That didn't take long." Val stepped closer. "You expected this." "I hoped it wouldn't happen." She looked toward the dark towers of Castle Black. "In my world," she said, "when a leader makes a choice like this, someone usually tries to kill him." Jon let out a quiet breath. "You're not very comforting." Val shrugged slightly. "I'm honest." For a moment, they simply stood together in the falling snow. Then Val said something softer. "Do you regret it?" Jon thought about that. The watch. Winterfell. His father's name. Finally, he shook his head. "No." Val nodded once. Good. She stepped closer, studying him carefully. You are about to become a king among wolves, she said. You should get used to danger. Jon almost laughed. I grew up with it. Val's lips curved slightly. Not like this. Suddenly heavy footsteps approached. Tormund appeared from the darkness, carrying a large axe across his shoulder. Crow, he said. Jon looked at him. What is it? Tormund glanced around the empty yard. Some of your black brothers are acting strange tonight. Jon frowned. How? They're moving around quietly, whispering. Val and Jon exchanged a glance. Tormund lowered his voice. In the real North, that's usually the moment before blood. Jon felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Inside Castle Black, shadows moved between torchlights. Some men carried knives hidden beneath their cloaks. Some whispered prayers. And some repeated a single phrase to give themselves courage. For the watch, the betrayal was already in motion. Snow fell harder as the night deepened, covering Castle Black in a quiet white silence. Torches burned low along the walls, their flames struggling against the wind. Most of the men of the Night's Watch had gone to their beds, but a few shadows moved quietly through the dark corridors. Jon Snow walked slowly across the courtyard toward the Lord Commander's tower. Something felt wrong. Tormund's warning stayed in his mind. In the real North, that's usually the moment before blood. Jon's hand rested lightly on the hilt of Longclaw. The familiar weight of the sword gave him some comfort. Behind him, Val and Tormund followed at a short distance. Neither of them spoke. Both of them were watching the castle carefully. A door creaked somewhere. Boots scraped against stone. Jon stopped walking. The courtyard was too quiet. Then a voice called out suddenly. Lord Commander. Jon turned. A young brother of the Watch hurried toward him through the snow. Jon recognized him, Ollie, the boy who had lost his parents to wildlings. Ollie looked nervous. What is it? Jon asked. There's trouble, my lord, the boy said breathlessly. A wildling prisoner says he has important news. He says he'll only tell you. Jon frowned. What kind of news? Ollie shook his head. He wouldn't say. Behind Jon, Tormund muttered under his breath. That smells like a trap. Jon looked back at him briefly. Maybe. But Jon also knew something else. The Night's Watch still had wildling prisoners in the ice cells. Some of them might truly have information about the lands beyond the wall. Where is he? Jon asked Ollie. In the yard by the shield hall, the boy answered. Jon nodded. Show me. They began walking again. Val stayed close beside Jon now, her sharp eyes moving from shadow to shadow. You trust that boy, she whispered quietly. Jon hesitated. I don't know. The group reached the darker part of the courtyard near the shield hall. The snow here was deeper. The torches were spaced farther apart. Jon slowed down. Where is the prisoner? He asked. Ollie stopped walking. He's right. The boy's voice faltered. Jon suddenly saw movement in the shadows. Too many shadows. Men stepped forward. Bowen Marsh. Othel Yarwick. Several other black brothers. Each one holding a dagger. Jon's stomach turned cold. So it's true, he said quietly. Bowen Marsh's face looked pale but determined. You have betrayed the Night's Watch. Jon did not draw Longclaw yet. By trying to save the North. By breaking your oath, Marsh snapped. Maury men stepped out from the darkness behind them. Jon realized there were at least a dozen. Tormund's grip tightened on his axe. Val's hand slowly moved toward the knife at her belt. This is foolish, Jon said calmly. It's necessary, Marsh replied. Snow swirled between them. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then one of the brothers shouted, "For the watch!" The first dagger struck fast. Jon barely twisted aside as the blade slashed across his shoulder instead of his heart. Pain exploded through his arm. Everything happened at once. Tormund roared like a beast and swung his axe, sending one of the attackers crashing into the snow. Val moved like lightning, her knife flashing as she slashed another brother across the arm. Jon drew Longclaw in a blur of steel. The Valyrian blade caught the torchlight as he blocked another dagger aimed at his chest. "Stop this," Jon shouted. But the men were already committed. Another brother rushed forward, stabbing wildly. Jon knocked the blade aside and struck him with the pummel of Longclaw, sending him to the ground. Behind him, Tormund smashed a man into a wall with brutal force. "Bloody crows," the wildling giant shouted. Maury brothers charged. One dagger slipped past Jon's defense and stabbed into his side. Jon gasped as pain tore through him. Warm blood spread beneath his cloak. For a second, the world blurred. This is how it ends. But then something unexpected happened. A war horn echoed suddenly through the night. A deep, booming sound that rolled across Castle Black. Everyone froze. Another horn answered. Then another. The gates of Castle Black burst open. Dozens of wildlings rushed into the courtyard. Tormund had quietly brought many of them inside the castle earlier that evening. They had been waiting outside, suspicious of the Watcher's behavior. Now they charged forward with axes, spears, and clubs. "Protect the crow," Tormund roared. Chaos exploded. Wildlings crashed into the Black Brothers, knocking them back. Knives clattered onto the snow. Some brothers ran. Others fought desperately. Bowen Marsh stared in horror at the sudden flood of wildlings. "You see," he shouted at Jon, "you've turned the Watch into a wildling camp." Jon gripped Longclaw tightly, breathing hard through the pain in his side. "No," Jon said quietly. "I'm trying to stop the world from ending." Marsh lunged forward one last time, dagger raised. Jon moved faster. Longclaw flashed once. The Valyrian steel sliced through Marsh's weapon and knocked him to the ground. Jon held the blade at the man's throat. Snow fell softly around them as the fighting slowly died down. Wildlings now filled the courtyard. The remaining brothers of the Watch stood surrounded. Jon looked down at Marsh. "This didn't have to happen." Marsh's face twisted with bitterness. "You were never one of us." Jon slowly lowered his sword. Maybe that had always been true. Behind him, Val stepped closer and pressed a hand gently against his wounded side. "You're bleeding badly," she said. Jon looked around the courtyard. Castle Black would never be the same after tonight. The Night's Watch had just tried to kill its own Lord Commander. And now the wildlings had saved him. Jon realized something in that moment. There was no going back to the old world. The North was about to change forever. The courtyard of Castle Black looked like a battlefield when the fighting finally stopped. Snow was trampled into dark slush. Several men lay groaning on the ground, while others were tied with rope under the watchful eyes of armed wildlings. Torches flickered in the cold wind, casting long shadows across the walls. Jon Snow sat on a wooden bench near the center of the yard, while Val pressed a cloth against the wound in his side. "You're lucky," she said quietly. "The blade missed anything important." Jon forced a small smile. "That seems to happen to me a lot." But he felt weak. The blood loss had taken its toll, and the world still spun slightly when he moved. Nearby, Tormund stood over the captured brothers of the Night's Watch like an angry bear. I say we throw the lot of them off the wall, he growled. Some wildlings laughed. Jon shook his head slowly. No. Tormund looked at him like he had gone mad. They tried to gut you, Crow. They're still my brothers, Jon replied. Tormund snorted loudly, but did not argue further. At that moment, the heavy doors of the king's tower opened. King Stannis Baratheon stepped out into the courtyard. Behind him came Davos Seaworth and several of the king's knights. Their armor gleamed under the torchlight. Stannis walked forward slowly, studying the scene with cold, calculating eyes. Wildlings. Night's Watch prisoners. Blood in the snow. His gaze finally landed on Jon. So, Stannis said flatly, the Watch has decided to kill its own commander. Jon stood up carefully, wincing as pain shot through his side. They believe I betrayed them. Stannis' jaw tightened. They are fools. Bowen Marsh and the other captured brothers were forced forward by the wildlings. Marsh looked pale, but still defiant. You have broken the sacred vows of the Night's Watch, he spat at Jon. Stannis turned toward him. The Night's Watch exists to defend the realm of men, the king said coldly, not to murder those trying to save it. Marsh glared back. You are not our king. Stannis took one slow step closer. Perhaps not, he said quietly, but I am still the man with an army. The courtyard fell silent. Davos stepped forward then, his voice calm. Lord Commander, or perhaps I should say something else now. Jon looked at him. Davos gave a small nod toward Stannis. The king raised his voice so everyone in the courtyard could hear. By the authority of the Iron Throne, Stannis declared, I hereby legitimize Jon Snow as Jon Stark. Murmurs spread through the wildlings and the remaining brothers of the Watch. Jon Stark, Stannis continued, rightful son of Eddard Stark and Lord of Winterfell. The words echoed against the massive wall behind them. Jon felt something strange in his chest. Jon Stark, a name he had dreamed about since he was a boy. But it also came with a terrible weight. Responsibility. War. Blood. Stannis pointed toward the captured conspirators. These men attempted to murder the rightful Lord of Winterfell. Bowen Marsh looked shocked. You cannot. I can, Stannis interrupted sharply. The king turned toward Jon. Their fate is yours to decide. Every eye in the courtyard turned toward Jon. Wildlings. Black brothers. Knights. Val watched him silently. Jon took a slow breath. A few months ago, he had been just a bastard serving the Night's Watch. Now he held the lives of these men in his hands. Jon walked slowly toward Bowen Marsh. The older man glared at him. You're no Stark, Marsh hissed. You're a traitor wearing a stolen name. Jon studied his face. I never wanted to be your enemy, Jon said quietly. Marsh said nothing. Snow continued falling around them. Finally, Jon spoke again. Release them. The courtyard erupted in confusion. Tormund blinked. What? Stannis frowned. You forgive them. Jon looked back at the king. They were wrong, Jon said, but they believed they were protecting the Watch. Marsh looked stunned. Jon continued. The Night's Watch is already dying. Killing more brothers won't save it. He turned to the prisoners. You are free to stay at Castle Black or leave. Some of the brothers looked ashamed. Others looked furious. Bowen Marsh slowly stood up. You are making a mistake, he muttered. Maybe, Jon said. Marsh turned and walked away into the darkness with several others. They did not look back. Tormund shook his head. You're either very brave or very stupid. Jon laughed softly. Probably both. Stannis stepped closer again. Mercy is rarely wise in war. Neither is needless cruelty, Jon replied. For a moment, the king studied him carefully. Then Stannis nodded slightly. Perhaps there is more Stark in you than I expected. He turned towards the gathered men. We march soon. Davos raised an eyebrow. So quickly. The Boltons grow stronger every day, Stannis said. We must strike before winter traps us. Jon looked south toward the distant lands beyond the wall. Winterfell. His home. Or what was left of it. Val stepped beside him. Looks like you're going to war, husband. Jon gave her a sideways glance. We are not married yet. Val smiled faintly. We will be. Tormund laughed loudly. I want a feast when it happens. Jon allowed himself a small smile. But deep inside, he knew the road ahead would be brutal. Because far to the south, inside the dark halls of Winterfell, another man was already preparing. Ramsay Bolton. And Ramsay loved traps. The wind howled across the frozen ground outside Castle Black as preparations for war began. For days the courtyard had been filled with movement. Wildlings sharpened axes beside blacksmiths. Stannis' knights inspected armor and horses. Wagons of supplies rolled in and out through the gate. The strange alliance between Southern Knights, the Night's Watch, and the Free Folk had turned the castle into something it had never been before, an army camp. Jon stood near the training yard, watching it all. Only a few weeks ago, he had been Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Now men called him something very different. Jon Stark. The name still felt strange. Behind him, Tormund Giant's Bane laughed loudly as he wrestled with two younger wildlings. Nearby, Stannis' soldiers watched the scene with confusion. The two groups still didn't trust each other. But they were learning to fight together. Footsteps crunched in the snow beside Jon. Val appeared, wrapped in a thick white fur cloak. Her pale hair moved gently in the wind. You stare like a man trying to memorize a dream, she said. Jon glanced at her. Just thinking. About Winterfell. Always. Val studied him for a moment. You should also think about tonight. Jon raised an eyebrow. What about tonight? Val smirked slightly. Our wedding. Jon sighed quietly. I was hoping you'd forgotten. Val laughed softly. In the Free Folk way, weddings are simple. A fire, witnesses, and a promise. Jon folded his arms. That sounds less complicated than Southern ones. Oh, it is, Val said with amusement, but it can still be dangerous. Jon frowned slightly. How? Val leaned closer and whispered. Wildlings like to drink. As night fell, the camp outside Castle Black filled with firelight. Dozens of large fires burned across the snow-covered ground. Wildlings gathered around them, roasting meat, drinking, and singing loud songs that echoed across the frozen land. Even some of Stannis' soldiers had joined the celebration, though they looked a little nervous, surrounded by so many rough warriors. Jon stood near the largest fire, wearing a heavy dark cloak. Beside him stood Stannis Baratheon, Davos Seaworth, Tormund, and many wildling chiefs. The strange group looked like something out of a legend. Davos leaned toward Jon quietly. Not exactly a traditional wedding, lad. Jon smiled slightly. I've never been very traditional. Val stepped forward from the crowd. Tonight she wore a simple white fur cloak tied with leather cords. A thin circlet made of woven branches rested in her hair. She looked more like a queen of the frozen north than any southern lady. The wildlings grew quiet. Tormund raised a large drinking horn. Tonight we join the crow and the spearwife. Cheers erupted. Jon stepped closer to Val. The firelight danced across her face. "You're sure about this?" Jon asked softly. Val's blue eyes shone with amusement. "You fought an army of the dead, but marriage scares you." "Maybe a little." She laughed. Then she held out her hand. Jon took it. One of the older wildling women stepped forward to speak the ancient free folk vows. "They stand before fire and frost," the woman said loudly, "two warriors from different worlds." The wind howled across the camp as sparks flew into the dark sky. "Do you choose each other freely?" Val answered first. "I do." Jon hesitated only for a moment. "I do." The old woman nodded. "Then share blood and breath." Val pulled a small knife from her belt. Without hesitation, she cut her palm lightly. Jon did the same. They pressed their hands together. Warm blood mixed between their fingers. The wildlings roared with approval. "You are bound now," the old woman declared. Tormund lifted his horn. To Jon Stark and Val. Hundreds of voices shouted together. To Jon Stark. The celebration exploded into loud laughter, drinking, and music. Jon looked around the firelit camp. Wildlings. Northern men. Southern knights. An army unlike any the North had ever seen. Val leaned closer to him. "Congratulations, husband." Jon smiled slightly. "Congratulations, wife." But far to the south, inside the dark stone halls of Winterfell, Ramsay Bolton stood before a large map. Several of his captains surrounded the table. A thin, cruel smile stretched across Ramsay's face. "So," he said softly, "the bastard has become a Stark." One of the men nodded nervously. "And he marches south with wildlings and Baratheon soldiers." Ramsay chuckled. "How exciting." He picked up a small wooden wolf from the map and placed it near Winterfell. "Let them come." Then he placed dozens of wooden markers around it. "They think this will be a battle." Ramsay's smile grew darker. "But it will be a hunt." Outside, the cold wind moved across the snowy fields of the north. Two armies were already marching toward each other. And soon, the fate of Winterfell would be decided. The morning after the wedding, the army began to move. Snow covered the land like a white blanket stretching endlessly toward the south. The sky was gray, and the cold wind cut across the frozen plains. It was the kind of weather that reminded everyone winter was not just coming anymore. It had arrived. Jon Stark rode at the front of the army beside Val. The horse beneath him moved slowly through the snow while hundreds of men marched behind them. Wildlings with axes and spears walked beside armored knights of Stannis Baratheon. The strange alliance still looked unnatural, but every mile south made them stronger. Tormund rode a shaggy horse nearby, grinning like a man who enjoyed war far too much. "This is good," he said loudly, "marching south to take castles. I like this better than freezing on the wall." Jon smiled faintly. Behind them stretched nearly 5,000 warriors. Not enough to conquer kingdoms, but enough to start a war. Davos Seaworth guided his horse closer to Jon. "Ravens have returned from the northern houses," Davos said. Jon looked at him. "And some are willing to join us." Jon felt a small spark of hope. "Which ones?" Davos pulled a folded piece of parchment from his coat. "House Mormont, the young Lady Lyanna says the North remembers the Starks." Jon couldn't help smiling at that. "Good." Davos continued. "House Hornwood has sent 50 men, not much, but it's something." Jon nodded. "And the others?" Davos's face became more serious. "House Karstark supports the Boltons." Jon expected that. The Karstarks had never forgiven Robb Stark. And the Umbers? Jon asked. Davos hesitated. That's complicated. Jon frowned. Meaning? Small Jon Umber has sworn loyalty to Ramsay, but rumors say many of his men don't trust the Boltons. Jon looked toward the southern horizon. The north was dividing, just like Ramsay wanted. Val spoke quietly beside him. In the free folk lands, when tribes fight each other, the strongest leader wins. Jon sighed. The north is more complicated. Tormund laughed. That just means more stabbing. Several days later, the army reached the outskirts of the northern forests. Tall pine trees stretched across the land, their branches heavy with snow. Scouts moved ahead carefully, searching for signs of Bolton forces. Jon and Stannis studied a rough map spread across a wooden crate. Winterfell is 2 days south, Stannis said. Jon nodded. And Ramsay knows we're coming. He wants us to come, Davos added. Stannis pointed to the map. The Boltons have more soldiers, perhaps 6,000. Jon wasn't surprised. But many of them are forced to fight, Jon said, northern men who hate Ramsay. Stannis looked unconvinced. Hate does not always defeat fear. That was true. Ramsay ruled through terror. Val leaned over the map. If he has more men, why hasn't he attacked us already? Stannis answered calmly. He prefers strong walls. Winterfell, a castle built to survive centuries of war. Storming it would cost thousands of lives. Jon shook his head. We can't attack the walls directly. Stannis looked at him. Then what do you suggest, Lord Stark? The title still felt strange. Jon studied the map carefully. We make him come to us. Davos raised an eyebrow. How? Jon looked up. By threatening something Ramsay cares about. Tormund grinned. Does that monster care about anything? Jon thought about the stories he had heard. The torture, the cruelty, the madness. Then Jon remembered something. His pride. Stannis' eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, that he has. Jon pointed toward a wide open field north of Winterfell. We challenge him. Davos blinked. You want to bait Ramsay into a battle outside the castle? Jon nodded. He thinks I'm still the bastard he defeated once before. He'll want to prove it again. Stannis studied him carefully. That is risky. Jon met his gaze. So is attacking Winterfell's walls. For a long moment, the king said nothing. Then slowly, he nodded. Very well. Far away in Winterfell, Ramsay Bolton stood atop the castle walls. Snow drifted gently across the courtyard below. A messenger knelt before him. The Stark army is 2 days away, my lord. Ramsay smiled slowly. And the challenge? The messenger swallowed nervously. They want battle outside the castle. Ramsay began to laugh. A cold, delighted laugh. How perfect! He turned toward the snow-covered fields beyond the walls. They think they're clever. One of his captains stepped closer. Should we refuse and stay behind the walls? Ramsay looked at him like he had just told a terrible joke. Refuse, Ramsay repeated. His smile grew wider. No. He turned back toward the map table. We accept. The captain frowned. But why risk an open battle? Ramsay picked up a small wooden wolf piece and crushed it slowly in his hand. Because I already know how this story ends. He leaned closer to the map. Hidden beneath the table were several extra markers. Armies, traps, ambushes waiting in the forests. You see, Ramsay whispered, this isn't just a battle. His eyes gleamed with excitement. It's a massacre. Meanwhile, Jon's army prepared for the fight that would decide the north. Men sharpened swords. Wildlings painted war symbols on their faces. Horses were fed and armored. Jon stood alone on a snowy hill overlooking the camp. Val walked up beside him quietly. You're worried. Jon nodded. I've fought Ramsay before. And you survived. Barely. Val crossed her arms. Then we make sure he doesn't survive this time. Jon looked south toward Winterfell. His home. The castle he had dreamed of returning to. But dreams were not enough to win wars. Because tomorrow, the battle for the north would begin. Dawn came slowly over the frozen fields north of Winterfell. A pale grey light spread across the snow, revealing two massive armies facing each other across the open land. The wind carried the sound of banners snapping and horses breathing clouds of steam into the cold air. Jon Stark stood at the front of his army. Beside him were Val, Tormund, Davos Seaworth, and the knights of Stannis Baratheon. Behind them stretched a strange army, armored southern soldiers standing beside wildlings wrapped in furs, northern men holding old Stark banners, and warriors who had never fought together before this moment. Across the field, the Bolton army waited. Thousands of soldiers stood in tight formation beneath the flayed man banners of House Bolton. Rows of spearmen formed solid walls while archers waited behind them. Cavalry units sat ready along the flanks. And at the center of it all rode Ramsay Bolton. Even from this distance, Jon could see the cruel confidence in Ramsay's posture. Tormund spat into the snow. That man smiles too much. Jon nodded. He thinks he's already won. Val narrowed her eyes. Then we prove him wrong. The horns sounded first. A deep echo rolled across the battlefield as both armies began to move. Stannis rode along the line of his soldiers, his voice carrying clearly. Hold formation. Jon turned to Tormund. Are your people ready? Tormund grinned, lifting his axe. They've been ready since breakfast. The wildlings roared their approval. Jon raised Longclaw high into the air. For the north, thousands of voices answered him. The battle began. Ramsay Bolton watched calmly from horseback. His army marched forward slowly in perfect formation. Look at them, he said with amusement to the man beside him. Wildlings and southern knights playing soldiers together. The captain beside him frowned. They have strong numbers. Ramsay shrugged. They also have chaos. He raised one hand. Signal the archers. Moments later, hundreds of Bolton arrows darkened the sky. The first wave rained down toward Jon's advancing army. Shields lifted. Men shouted. Several warriors fell screaming into the snow. But Jon had expected that. Shilds forward, he shouted. Stannis' disciplined soldiers formed a protective wall, while wildlings rushed between the gaps. Arrows struck wood and metal, but the army kept moving. Val rode beside Jon now, her spear ready. You planned for this. Ramsay likes arrows, Jon said grimly. Across the battlefield, Ramsay watched the army continue advancing despite the attack. Interesting, he murmured. He turned to another officer. Release the hounds. A gate opened behind the Bolton lines. Dozens of massive war dogs burst forward, sprinting across the snow with terrifying speed. The beasts snarled and barked as they rushed toward Jon's forces. Wildlings shouted warnings. But Tormund stepped forward, laughing loudly. Finally, something fun. The wildlings met the charging dogs with axes and spears. Several beasts were cut down quickly, while others tore into soldiers before being killed. The clash turned savage and brutal. Jon pushed forward through the chaos. This was only the beginning. He knew Ramsay had something worse planned. Then it happened. A horn blast echoed from the forest to the east. Jon's heart sank. Married Bolton soldiers poured out from the trees. An ambush force. Davos cursed under his breath. Just like we feared. But Jon did not panic. He raised his hand. Now, another horn sounded, this one from behind their own lines. Hidden among the hills, several hundred mounted wildlings suddenly appeared, charging down toward the ambushing Bolton troops. Tormund laughed wildly. You're not the only one who likes surprises. The wildling cavalry smashed into the Bolton ambush with brutal force. Ramsay's smile faded slightly as he watched. So the bastard learned something. The battlefield descended into complete chaos. Steel clashed. Men screamed. Snow turned red. Jon rode straight into the fighting, Longclaw flashing through the air as he cut down a Bolton soldier who rushed toward him. Val fought beside him like a storm, her spear striking quickly and precisely. The combined forces of Stannis and the wildlings began pushing the Bolton army backward. But Ramsay was not finished yet. He raised his hand again. Another signal horn blew. This time, a new line of soldiers marched forward, carrying large wooden shields. Behind them stood rows of archers. Form the wall, Ramsay ordered calmly. The Bolton soldiers locked shields together, creating an almost solid barrier. Then the archers fired again. But this time, they aimed differently. Not at Jon's army. At their own fallen soldiers. Bodies began piling up quickly in front of Jon's advancing forces. Val frowned. What is he doing? Jon suddenly realized the truth. Ramsay was building something. A wall. A massive barrier of corpses. Soon Jon's army found itself trapped between the rising pile of bodies and the Bolton shield wall. Just like Ramsay had planned. Tormund looked around grimly. We are being boxed in. Arrows rained down again from every side. The trap was closing. Jon gripped Longclaw tightly. Ramsay Bolton sat comfortably on his horse, watching the chaos. The same cruel smile had returned to his face. You see, Ramsay said softly, I told you. This is a massacre. Jon looked around the battlefield. Men were dying everywhere. The trap was tightening. But he also noticed something Ramsay had overlooked. Wildlings. Unlike trained soldiers, they did not fight in rigid formations. They climbed. They adapted. They survived. Jon turned toward Tormund. I have an idea. Tormund grinned. Good, because I'm running out of enemies to hit. Jon raised Longclaw again and shouted to the wildlings. Climb the wall. The wildlings looked confused for only a moment. Then they understood. Like wolves, they rushed toward the growing wall of bodies and began climbing over it. Ramsay's soldiers stared in shock as hundreds of wildlings scrambled up the corpse barrier like savage mountain climbers. Within seconds, they were dropping behind the Bolton shield wall. The trap had just reversed. Ramsay's smile finally disappeared. Oh, he muttered. Well, that's inconvenient. The battlefield had become something terrible. Snow that had once been pure white was now soaked red. The cold air carried the smell of blood, steel, and smoke. Cries of wounded men echoed across the field as the battle reached its most brutal moment. Jon Stark stood near the growing wall of bodies, breathing hard. His cloak was torn and dark with blood, and Longclaw dripped red in his hand. But something had changed. The wildlings had done exactly what he hoped they would. They climbed, like wolves scaling a cliff. Hundreds of wildlings scrambled up the pile of bodies Ramsay had created. Hands grabbed armor, boots pushed against frozen corpses, and within moments they were dropping down behind the Bolton shield wall. The Bolton soldiers never expected it. Suddenly, the tight formation that had been protecting Ramsay's army was attacked from both sides. Chaos exploded. Wildlings roared like beasts as they crashed into the archers and shield-bearers from behind. Spears fell, shields broke apart. The perfect Bolton formation collapsed instantly. Tormund was the first over the wall. He landed among the Bolton soldiers like a falling tree, swinging his axe with terrifying strength. For the north, he bellowed. Behind him came dozens more wildlings. Jon saw the moment the battle turned. Stannis' soldiers pushed forward from the front, while wildlings attacked from the rear. The Bolton line shattered. Men began running. Across the field, Ramsay Bolton watched the disaster unfold. For the first time that day, he did not look amused. His captain rode up beside him in panic. "My lord, the line is collapsing." Ramsay stared coldly at the battlefield. He could see wildlings flooding through the broken formation. Bolton soldiers were throwing down weapons and fleeing toward Winterfell. He sighed softly. How disappointing. Another messenger rode toward him. The Stark forces are pushing through the center. Ramsay finally turned his horse toward the castle in the distance. "Then I suppose it's time to leave." The captain blinked. "You're retreating." Ramsay gave him a sharp smile. "Of course not." He looked back at the burning battlefield. "I'm surviving." With that, Ramsay spurred his horse and rode toward Winterfell. Jon saw the Bolton banners falling one by one. Victory was close. But suddenly, Davos rode up beside him. "Jon." Jon turned. "What is it?" "Ramsay is fleeing toward the castle." Jon's eyes hardened. "No." He climbed onto his horse immediately. "Tormund," he shouted. The wildling giant looked up from the fight. "What now?" Jon pointed toward Winterfell. "The hunt isn't finished." Tormund grinned like a man hearing wonderful news. Finally, Jon gathered a small group of riders. Val mounted her horse beside him. "You're chasing him?" "Yes." She smiled slightly. "I thought you might." Jon kicked his horse forward. They raced across the battlefield toward Winterfell. The massive gates of Winterfell slammed shut just moments after Ramsay rode through them. But Jon and his riders were already approaching. Behind them, the victorious army marched closer. Jon dismounted near the gate, breathing heavily. The castle walls loomed above him. His home. After everything, he had finally returned. Tormund looked up at the walls. "So how do we get in?" Jon stared at the gate. "We don't wait." Within the hour, Stannis' soldiers brought forward a massive battering ram. Again and again, it slammed against the wooden gates. Boom! 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 Inside the castle, Ramsay Bolton waited in the courtyard. His armor was half removed, and his face looked strangely calm. A servant approached nervously. "My lord, the gates will not hold long." Ramsay smiled faintly. "That's fine." He turned toward the kennels nearby. Several large hounds barked hungrily inside their cages. They must be starving by now. The servant swallowed nervously. "Yes, you ordered them unfed for days." Ramsay chuckled softly. Good. Outside the gate. Crack. The massive doors of Winterfell finally splintered apart. Jon Stark stepped through the broken gate first. Behind him came wildlings, northern soldiers, and Stannis' knights. The courtyard fell silent. At the far end stood Ramsay Bolton. For a moment, neither man moved. Jon walked forward slowly. "You lost," Jon said. Ramsay tilted his head slightly. "Did I?" Then he whistled sharply. The kennel doors burst open. A pack of starving hounds charged forward, teeth bared. But Jon did not move. Instead, Val stepped forward calmly. She let out a sharp, wildling whistle. The hounds slowed. Confused. Wildlings had raised dogs for generations. They knew the sounds. The beasts hesitated. Then something unexpected happened. They turned. Not toward Jon. Toward Ramsay, the man who had starved them. Ramsay's smile vanished. "Wait!" The hounds attacked. Ramsay Bolton screamed as the pack dragged him to the ground. The courtyard watched in stunned silence. Tormund crossed his arms. "Well, that solves that problem." Jon turned away. He had no desire to watch. Minutes later, the screams stopped. Snow began falling gently over Winterfell once again. Jon walked slowly toward the castle gates and looked across the courtyard. The Stark banners were rising again. Val stepped beside him. "You're home." Jon looked at the ancient walls of Winterfell, the place where he had once been just a lonely bastard boy. Now he stood there as something very different. Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, King in the North. Tormund lifted a horn and shouted loudly. "The King in the North." Thousands of voices answered across the castle and battlefield. "The King in the North." Jon looked toward the snowy northern horizon. Beyond the wall, the dead were still coming. But now the North was united. And this time, they would be ready.